The unforgiving flash of 100 cameras can feel like a physical blow. For Isabella Beaumont, it was the sound of her world shattering. On the iconic steps of the Met, her husband of 10 years, the formidable CEO Richard Beaumont, didn't just leave her, he replaced her. In front of the entire world, he cast her aside for a younger woman, leaving Isabella, a solitary, abandoned figure in a sea of couture and judgment. They called her a tragic footnote in a billionaire's love story. They thought she would disappear. But they forgot one thing: embers can survive any storm, and sometimes they return as a wildfire. The air on the first Monday in May always crackled with a unique kind of energy, a potent cocktail of old money, new fame, and the silent, vicious judgment of the global elite. For Isabella Beaumont, the annual Met Gala had always been the pinnacle of this world, a night she meticulously planned for months. As the wife of Richard Beaumont, the ruthless CEO of the monolithic Beaumont Holdings, her role was clear: be the perfect, elegant accessory. She curated his image, smoothed over his social brutalities, and ensured their table was the most sought after in the grand hall. She was the architect of his social reign, a ghost writer for his public life. This year felt different. The ride to the museum in their custom Rolls-Royce Phantom was suffocatingly silent. Richard hadn't looked at her once, his jaw a hard line of granite, as he stared out at the flashing lights of Manhattan. Isabella, dressed in a bespoke midnight blue gown by Chanel that had taken 400 hours to bead, felt a familiar chill creep up her spine. It was a coldness that had been growing in their Park Avenue penthouse for months, a silence that devoured conversation and left a void in its wake. "You look tense, darling," she said, her voice a soft melody she hoped might soothe the beast beside her. He finally turned his head, his steel-grey eyes sweeping over her with an unnerving detachment, as if she were a piece of art he was considering selling. "Just thinking about business, Isabella. You wouldn't understand." The condescension, once a subtle prick, was now a dagger's edge. She had a master's degree in art history from the Sorbonne, spoke 4 languages, and had single-handedly negotiated the acquisition of a Parisian boutique hotel that was now one of their most profitable assets. But in Richard's world, her contributions were invisible, unacknowledged. As they stepped onto the cream-colored carpet, the roar of the press was deafening. "Richard, Isabella. Over here." The flashes were a relentless, blinding assault. Richard's hand was on her lower back, a proprietary gesture that felt less like affection and more like ownership. He smiled his predator's smile for the cameras, a perfect performance of a man in control. Isabella mirrored him, her own smile, a fragile mask she had perfected over a decade. They were halfway up the grand staircase when he stopped. The pause was so abrupt that the flow of celebrity traffic behind them stuttered. He pulled his hand away from her back. The absence of his touch was a physical shock, as cold and final as a closing door. "Richard, what is it?" she whispered, her smile faltering. He didn't look at her. He looked past her down the stairs. And that's when Isabella saw her. Chloe Sterling, a model barely out of her teens with eyes as vacant as her ambitions were transparent. She was wearing a scandalously sheer dress, a stark contrast to Isabella's timeless elegance. Chloe was ascending the stairs, a smug smile playing on her lips. Richard's voice was low, devoid of any emotion. Yet it was the cruelest sound Isabella had ever heard. "Our journey together ends here, Isabella." The world seemed to slow down. The roar of the press faded into a dull hum. She could see the reporters from Vogue and the New York Times, their eyes widening, sensing the seismic shift. "What are you talking about?" She managed, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm saying this is over," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were flat, merciless. "I've filed for divorce. My lawyers will be in touch with yours. Chloe is my date for the evening." He turned his back on her. He walked down 2 steps and took Chloe's waiting hand, pulling her up to his side. He kissed Chloe, a possessive, performative act for the world to see, right there on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then together they continued up the stairs, leaving Isabella standing completely, utterly alone. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, she was frozen, a statue of discarded grace. Then the cameras, realizing what had just happened, turned on her. The flashes became frantic, hungry. The questions were shouted sharp and brutal. "Isabella, is it true? Did he just leave you on the red carpet?" "Mrs. Beaumont, what are your thoughts on Chloe Sterling?" Every flash felt like a stone being thrown. Every shouted question was a new crack in her crumbling facade. She could feel the pitying stares from Anna Wintour, the schadenfreude-laced glances from rival society wives. She was no longer Isabella Beaumont, wife of a titan. She was a spectacle, a tragedy in real time. Her breath hitched. The magnificent gown felt like a lead weight. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she turned, ignoring the cacophony. She did not run. She walked, head held high, back down the stairs through the gauntlet of gawking celebrities and ravenous press, each step an agony of public humiliation. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Because if she did, the entire world would see that the perfect, polished wife of Richard Beaumont was weeping. As she stumbled out onto the street, the cold night air hitting her tear-streaked face, she heard the final pronouncement from a television reporter speaking into his camera. "In the most shocking red carpet moment of the decade, billionaire Richard Beaumont has publicly ended his marriage to Isabella Beaumont, debuting his new relationship with model Chloe Sterling. A truly brutal end to a society fairy tale." Isabella hailed the first yellow cab. She saw a lifeboat in a stormy sea. As she crumpled into the worn leather seat, the driver looked at her in the rear-view mirror, his eyes wide. "Lady, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse." She whispered the words, catching in her throat, as the cab sped away from the glittering museum, carrying her away from the ruins of her life. "I've just become one." The divorce was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Richard, with his army of ruthless lawyers from Skadden Arps, didn't just want to end the marriage. He wanted to erase Isabella from the narrative of his success. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed at 24, naive and blinded by love, was ironclad. It entitled her to a settlement that, while substantial to an ordinary person, was a pittance to a man of Richard's stature, a calculated insult designed to remind her of her place. The media, fueled by strategic leaks from Richard's PR team, painted a damning portrait of her. She was portrayed as a socialite wife, with extravagant spending habits, mentally unstable and emotionally volatile. They twisted her passion for art into a frivolous hobby, her meticulous event planning into obsessive control. Chloe Sterling was photographed laughing with Richard on a yacht in St. Bart's, while tabloids ran grainy pictures of Isabella, cloaked in a large coat and sunglasses, looking like a fugitive in her own city. The Park Avenue penthouse, once her sanctuary, became a gilded cage filled with ghosts. Every Lalique vase, every Rothko on the wall, was a testament to a life that was no longer hers. Movers dispatched by Richard's office came and packed her things with cold, impersonal efficiency. They were careful not to damage the assets that belonged to the Beaumont estate. Her personal belongings felt small and insignificant in comparison. Her friends, the society women with whom she'd shared lunches at Balthazar and charity board meetings, vanished. Their calls went unanswered. Their polite, pitying smiles were replaced with a stony silence. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails at the polo bar. To associate with her was to risk the ire of Richard Beaumont, and no one was willing to pay that price. 1 month after the Met Gala broken and utterly adrift, Isabella left New York City. She drove for 7 hours in her modest Audi, the only car registered solely in her name, until she reached the coast of Maine. There, nestled in a rocky cove overlooking the tumultuous Atlantic, was a small, salt-weathered cottage her grandmother had left her. It was the only thing Richard hadn't been able to touch. The cottage was her antithesis to Park Avenue. It smelled of old books, sea salt and wood smoke. The floors creaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and the plumbing was temperamental. It was perfect. For weeks, she did nothing. She slept. She walked the foggy shoreline, and she stared at the relentless grey waves, feeling a kinship with their turbulent, ceaseless motion. She let the grief wash over her, a tide of betrayal, humiliation, and profound loss. She cried until she had no tears left, her sobs swallowed by the roar of the ocean. One rainy afternoon, seeking refuge from the storm, both outside and within, she climbed the rickety ladder to the cottage's small attic. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a grimy porthole window. The attic was a graveyard of forgotten things. Old furniture draped in white sheets, a child's rocking horse, and stacks of cardboard boxes. In one corner, she found a large wooden trunk, her grandmother's trunk. Prying open the rusted latch, she was greeted by the familiar, comforting scent of aged paper. Inside were not old clothes or keepsakes, but her own forgotten life. There were her college textbooks on Florentine art, her dissertation on the female painters of the Baroque period, and notebooks filled with her meticulous, elegant script, detailing her research and her passionate original theories. She had been brilliant, a rising star in her academic field, the youngest person to ever be offered a fellowship at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. She had given it all up for Richard. He had called her passion a cute hobby, but had insisted that the wife of a man like him couldn't have a job. Her place was by his side, and she, so in love, had agreed. She had packed her ambitions away in this very trunk, believing that his life was now hers. Flipping through the pages of a notebook, her fingers traced a sketch she had made of Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith slaying Holofernes. She remembered the fire she had felt studying that painting, a raw depiction of female rage and righteous vengeance. A small, unfamiliar feeling began to flicker in the cold, empty space in her chest. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something harder, something sharper. It was indignation. She had allowed him to diminish her. She had let him convince her that her only value was as a reflection of his own greatness. He hadn't just taken her home and her name. He had tried to take her very identity. That night, for the first time in months, she didn't just sleep. She dreamt. She dreamt of gilded frames and the smell of oil paint, of dusty archives, and the thrill of discovery. She dreamt of the woman she was before she became Mrs. Beaumont. The next morning, the storm had broken. A sliver of pale sun cut through the clouds, illuminating the sea. Isabella made a pot of coffee, sat down at the old wooden desk, overlooking the ocean, and opened a fresh notebook. She uncapped a pen, its click echoing in the quiet cottage. At the top of the page, she wrote not Isabella Beaumont, but her maiden name, the name of the woman who had once been promised a fellowship at the Uffizi, Isabella Rossi. And beneath it, she wrote her first title in over a decade, The Unseen Hand, Patronage and Power in the Medici Courts. The storm inside her was far from over, but for the first time she wasn't drowning. She was learning to build a lighthouse. The quiet solitude of the Maine coast became Isabella's crucible. The days melted into a routine governed not by social calendars, but by her own burgeoning intellectual curiosity. She rose with the sun, walked the beach as the morning mist rolled off the Atlantic, and then spent 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day hunched over her research. The world of Renaissance art, which she had abandoned for a decade, welcomed her back like a long-lost friend. She converted the small sunroom of the cottage into a study, lining the walls with second-hand bookshelves that soon overflowed. She used a portion of her settlement to acquire rare auction catalogues, scholarly journals, and obscure historical texts. Her mind, once dulled by years of small talk and society gossip, sharpened to a razor's edge. She was reconnecting with the part of herself she had been forced to amputate to fit into Richard's world. After 3 months of intense private work, she felt a stirring of something she hadn't felt in years: ambition. She wanted to share her discoveries, to re-enter the conversation she had been absent from for so long. But the academic world was insular, and the name Isabella Beaumont was now toxic, synonymous with tabloid scandal. She needed a new platform, a way to build a reputation based purely on the merit of her work. She decided to start a blog. It felt modern, accessible, and crucially it allowed her a degree of anonymity. She called it The Gilded Brush. Her first post was an incisive, brilliantly argued piece on the misattribution of a minor work long thought to be from the studio of Titian. Using stylistic analysis and cross-referencing pigment sourcing from 16th century Venetian shipping manifests a research angle. No one had explored, she argued compellingly, that it was actually the work of a forgotten female artist, Irene di Spilimbergo. She published the post under the simple, academic-sounding byline, I, Rossi. For a week there was silence. Then a single comment appeared. It was from a professor emeritus at Oxford. A fascinating and audacious claim, Ms. Rossi. You may be onto something. That one comment was like a crack of lightning. Slowly, others followed. Art historians, curators, and serious collectors began to take notice. Her writing was a revelation, passionate, but rigorously academic, accessible, but deeply intelligent. She wrote about the economics of art in the Dutch Golden Age, the political propaganda hidden in Jacobean portraiture, and the secret rivalries of the great masters. The Gilded Brush became a cult favorite in the art world. Its mysterious author, I. Rossi, a subject of intense speculation. 6 months after its inception, the blog had tens of thousands of dedicated readers. Museums started citing her work in their digital archives. Prestigious art journals requested submissions. All of this happened in a world far removed from the gossip columns of Page 6, which were still breathlessly documenting Richard and Chloe's vapid escapades. One evening, an email arrived that made Isabella's heart stop. The sender was Adrian Thorne, the founder and CEO of Thorne Ventures, a boutique investment firm known for its aggressive, forward-thinking strategies. Thorne Ventures was the sharpest, most agile rival to the staid behemoth Beaumont Holdings. But Isabella knew Adrian Thorne for another reason. He was one of the most astute and private art collectors in the world. The email was brief and direct. Subject: Your work on D. Spilimbergo, Ms. Rossi. I have been following your blog, The Gilded Brush, with great interest. Your scholarship is impeccable, and your perspective is refreshingly original. Your piece on Irene di Spilimbergo was nothing short of revolutionary. I believe I may own the very piece you wrote about. I would be honored if you would consider a private consultation to verify your findings. My firm will of course compensate you for your time and travel. Sincerely, Adrian Thorne. Isabella stared at the screen, her mind racing. This was it. This was the bridge from her isolated cottage back into the world, not as a disgraced wife, but as a respected expert. It was a chance to prove her worth on her own terms. But it also meant stepping out from behind the anonymity of I, Rossi. It meant facing the world, a world that might still see her as Richard Beaumont's pathetic ex-wife. And there was another complication. Adrian Thorne was Richard's most significant business rival. Their enmity was the stuff of Wall Street legend. For her to work with him would be seen as a profound act of betrayal by some and a declaration of war by others. A year ago, the thought would have terrified her. She would have worried about how it looked about Richard's reaction. But as she looked around her sunroom, at the books that were now her friends, and the words that were now her armor, she felt a surge of defiant strength. Richard had never cared about how his actions looked to her. He had never considered her feelings. Why should she still be living her life in the shadow of his ego? She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, with a steady hand, she began to type her reply. Mr. Thorne. Thank you for your kind words. I would be delighted to arrange a consultation. Sincerely, Isabella Rossi. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The sea breeze blew in through the open window, carrying the scent of salt and new beginnings. The game had just changed. 2 weeks later, Isabella stood before the gleaming steel and glass headquarters of Thorne Ventures in downtown Manhattan. The building was a statement, sleek, modern, and audacious, a stark contrast to the heavy neoclassical monolith that housed Beaumont Holdings. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she walked through the revolving doors. The interior was more like an art gallery than a corporate office. A massive Anselm Kiefer painting dominated the lobby, and the receptionist sat behind a desk that looked like a Zaha Hadid sculpture. Everything about the place spoke of a modern, refined taste that was worlds away from Richard's ostentatious displays of wealth. She was led directly to the top floor. Adrian Thorne's office was a corner suite with panoramic views of the city, but Isabella's eyes were immediately drawn to the painting hanging on the wall behind his desk. It was the Titian, or rather the D. Spilimbergo. It was more vibrant and emotionally resonant in person than any photograph could convey. Adrian Thorne rose from his desk to greet her. He was younger than Richard, perhaps in his early 40s, with dark, intelligent eyes that held a hint of amusement. He was dressed in a tailored suit, but wore no tie, projecting an air of relaxed confidence. "Miss Rossi," he said, his voice a warm baritone. He extended a hand. "Adrian Thorne, it's a genuine honor to meet the mind behind the gilded brush." "The honor is mine, Mr. Thorne. Thank you for inviting me," Isabella replied, her voice steady, despite the flutter in her stomach. There was no flicker of recognition in his eyes, no sign that he saw her as the disgraced wife from the tabloids. He saw her as I, Rossi the scholar. It was an incredibly liberating feeling. "Please call me Adrian," he said, gesturing to a pair of leather chairs near the painting. "So this is the lady in question. Tell me everything?" For the next 2 hours, Isabella lost herself in her passion. She spoke about the subtle brushwork, the unique composition of the lapis lazuli pigment in the subject's robes, and the painting's provenance, which she had painstakingly traced through centuries of private sales. Adrian listened intently, asking sharp, insightful questions. He wasn't just a man who bought art. He was a man who understood it. "It's conclusive," she finished, her voice filled with conviction. "The brushwork is identical to the 2 other confirmed works by D. Spilimbergo. This isn't just from Titian's studio. This is her masterpiece." Adrian stared at the painting for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Incredible. I've had a dozen so-called experts look at this piece, and they all told me what I wanted to hear. It's a Titian. You're the first person to tell me the truth." He turned his gaze back to her, and his eyes were full of genuine admiration. "You have an extraordinary gift, Isabella." He had used her first name, and for the first time she felt he might know who she was. She braced herself for the inevitable question about Richard, but it never came. Instead, he said, "This brings me to my real reason for inviting you here. I am in the process of establishing a philanthropic foundation dedicated to acquiring and promoting the work of historically overlooked female artists. I need a director to shape its vision, to lead the research, and to curate the collection. Someone with integrity, a brilliant eye, and the courage to challenge the established consensus. I want you." Isabella was speechless. A foundation, her own collection to build. It was a dream she had never even dared to entertain. "Mr. Thorne, Adrian, I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say you'll consider it," he said gently. "The position would give you complete autonomy and a substantial budget. We would provide you with a research team, a lab, and a gallery space right here in this building." It was an offer that would not only restore her career, but elevate it to heights she had never imagined. It would also place her in direct opposition to her former life. Richard was a major patron of the Met, his name emblazoned on a wing. For his ex-wife to helm a new rival foundation, backed by his biggest competitor, would be a public declaration of war. As if reading her mind, Adrian's tone became more serious. "I'm aware of your history, Isabella. I won't pretend I'm not. To be frank, it's one of the reasons I sought you out. Richard Beaumont has underestimated talented people his entire life, especially women. I have a feeling he made the biggest mistake of his career when he underestimated you. His loss could be my foundation's greatest gain." There was no pity in his voice, only respect and opportunity. He wasn't offering her a handout. He was offering her a throne of her own. Meanwhile, at Beaumont Holdings, the cracks were beginning to show. Richard had always relied on Isabella's intuitive understanding of people and culture to seal his international deals. She was the one who knew which government official's wife was a fan of a particular jewelry designer, or which obscure cultural custom to observe to show respect. With Chloe by his side, who was more interested in photo opportunities than diplomatic subtleties, a massive deal for a luxury resort development in Japan had just collapsed. The Japanese partners cited a lack of cultural synergy and a disrespectful presentation, a presentation Chloe had insisted on modernizing. The loss was a staggering 9-figure blow to the company's prestige and bottom line, sending tremors through the boardroom. Richard was furious, but he was blind to the true cause of the problem, the absence of the silent partner who had always been his greatest asset. Isabella looked from Adrian's earnest face to the masterpiece on the wall, a work of genius by a woman history had tried to forget. She thought of the cottage in Maine of the anonymous blog, and of the woman she was becoming. She was done being silent. She was done being invisible. "Adrian," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept." A grin spread across his face, lighting up his entire demeanor. "Excellent. Welcome to the Thorn Foundation Director, Rossi. I think we're going to make history." The announcement of the Thorn Foundation with Isabella Rossi as its inaugural director sent a shockwave through the worlds of art, business, and society. The story was irresistible. The scorned wife of Richard Beaumont, long dismissed as a mere socialite, had re-emerged as a powerful new player backed by her ex-husband's chief rival. Vanity Fair ran a feature profile titled The Rossi Renaissance, complete with stunning portraits of Isabella in her new office, looking poised, intelligent, and in control. She was no longer a victim. She was a victor. For Richard, the news was a public and personal humiliation. He had tried to bury her, to render her irrelevant. Instead, she had risen from the ashes, more formidable than ever. His rage was volcanic. He saw it as a calculated attack, a conspiracy between the two people he despised most. His paranoia, coupled with the mounting financial pressure on Beaumont Holdings after a series of missteps, was making him erratic and short-tempered. The epicenter of this looming collision was the annual Orion Ball, the most exclusive charity gala of the year. For the past decade, it had been hosted and chaired by the Beaumonts. It was Isabella's signature event. Her meticulous planning and impeccable taste were what made it the jewel of the New York social season. This year, the reins had been handed to Chloe Sterling. The result was a catastrophe in the making. Chloe's vision was loud, garish, and self-serving. The theme was a chaotic diamonds and decadence, and the press was filled with reports of disgruntled vendors, clashing color schemes, and Chloe's diva-like demands. The old guard of New York society was quietly pulling their support, and ticket sales were lagging for the first time in the event's history. The Orion Ball was becoming a reflection of Richard's own declining empire, flashy on the surface but hollow within. In her new office overlooking Central Park, Isabella received her invitation. It was addressed to Ms. Isabella Rossi and guest. A week later, Adrian casually mentioned it. "I assume you won't be going," he said, leaning against her office doorframe. "It was my event for 10 years, Isabella said, her voice neutral as she examined a research document. "I built it from a simple fundraiser into what it is, or what it was." "It would be a statement." Adrian noted his eyes, watching her carefully. "Your first public appearance at a major event since—" He didn't need to finish. "Since the Met Gala. The scene of her execution. The idea of returning to that world, of facing those same people, sent a flicker of her old fear through her. But it was quickly replaced by something else resolve. She wasn't that broken woman in the Chanel gown anymore. "I won't be hiding Adrian," she said, looking up and meeting his gaze. "But I won't go alone." His smile was subtle. "I would be honored to be your guest director, Rossi." Isabella knew she couldn't just attend. She had to arrive. This wasn't just an evening out. It was a strategic maneuver. She contacted a young avant-garde designer named Marcus Thorne, no relation to Adrian, a fact that amused them both, who was known for his architectural, sculptural gowns. She didn't want a dress. She wanted armor. For weeks, they worked in secret. She showed him photos of Carthaginian warriors and Byzantine mosaics. She spoke of strength, resilience, and the beauty of molten gold. The result was a masterpiece. The gown was crafted from a liquid gold lamb that shimmered and moved like it was alive. It was deceptively simple in its silhouette, a high neck, long sleeves, and a column skirt that pooled at the floor. But its power was in its texture and its unapologetic, brilliant radiance. It was the color of a crown, of a treasure unearthed. The night of the Orion Ball arrived. The ballroom at the plaza was a chaotic mess of Chloe's design ice sculptures, dripped onto priceless rugs, and the floral arrangements were aggressively large. Richard, looking strained and older than his years, was on stage attempting to give the opening remarks. His speech was stilted, his usual charisma gone, replaced by a desperate, blustering energy as he tried to rally support for a new Beaumont Holdings project. And it is with this vision of the future, he was saying, his voice echoing slightly in the half-empty room, that Beaumont Holdings will continue to lead. At that exact moment, the grand doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, conversations halted. Richard faltered mid-sentence, his eyes following the gaze of his audience. Framed in the doorway stood Isabella. She was a vision of pure molten gold. The gown caught the light from the chandeliers, bathing her in a halo of brilliance. Her hair was swept back in a severe, elegant chignon, showcasing a pair of simple diamond earrings, the only jewelry she wore. Her face was serene, her posture perfect. She wasn't just wearing a dress. She was inhabiting it. Beside her, Adrian Thorne was a figure of quiet strength, his hand resting lightly on her back. The press, who had been huddled by the bar complaining about the event, suddenly surged forward. The sound was like a sudden crack of thunder, the frantic, hungry clicking and flashing of dozens of cameras all aimed at one person. The flashes bounced off her golden gown, creating a dazzling, almost blinding spectacle. On stage, Richard Beaumont was frozen. His mouth hung slightly open. The teleprompter continued to scroll, but he had lost his place, lost his voice. All he could see was the woman he had thrown away, standing in the doorway of his failing party, looking not like a ghost from his past, but like the queen of a new and better kingdom. She met his shocked gaze from across the room, and for the first time in more than a year, she gave him a small, knowing, and utterly triumphant smile. The king had been checkmated in his own castle. The effect of Isabella's arrival was cataclysmic. She and Adrian didn't just enter the room, they conquered it. Within minutes they were surrounded by the very people who had shunned her a year ago. Bankers, artists, and society matriarchs who had once ghosted her calls were now falling over themselves to praise the Thorne Foundation, to compliment her gown, to simply be seen in her orbit. Power, she realized, was a more compelling currency than history. She was no longer Richard's ex-wife. She was the woman who had Adrian Thorne's ear. From his position on the stage, Richard watched the scene unfold with a fury that was nearly apoplectic. He aborted his speech, mumbling a few concluding remarks to a distracted audience, and stormed off the stage, his face a thunderous mask. Chloe, looking flustered and cheap in her garish diamond-encrusted dress, hurried after him. "Richard, what do we do?" she hissed, grabbing his arm. "She's ruining everything. Stay away from her," Richard snarled, shaking her off. "I'll handle this." He cut a swath through the crowd, his presence parting the sea of guests until he stood before Isabella. Adrian, sensing the confrontation, subtly positioned himself at her side, a silent guardian. "Isabella," Richard began, his voice a low growl. "What a surprise. I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face here." Isabella met his rage with a calm that was more unnerving than any shouted reply. "Hello, Richard. You seem tense. Are things not going as planned?" She gestured vaguely at the garish decorations. "This is all very Chloe." The insult, delivered with such cool precision, struck a nerve. "You think this is funny?" he shot back. "Coming here on the arm of this vulture, trying to sabotage my event? Your event seems to be sabotaging itself just fine. Adrian interjected smoothly, his voice dangerously mild. And I'd watch who you're calling a vulture, Richard, especially when your own company is starting to look a lot like carrion. Richard's face flushed a deep red. You stay out of this, Thorn. This is between me and my wife. Ex-wife, Isabella corrected him, her voice like a chip of ice. And you have no right to speak to me or about me any longer. You forfeited that right on the steps of the Met. For a moment, Richard looked genuinely stunned, as if he couldn't comprehend her defiance. He was so accustomed to her placating him, to her absorbing his anger. He tried a different tactic, his voice dropping into a mock, sympathetic tone. Look at you, Isabella, dressed up in a ridiculous costume, playing businesswoman. Do you really think this little act will last? You're nothing without the Beaumont name. It was his final, most desperate weapon, the attempt to diminish her, to remind her of the scared, broken woman she once was. But that woman was gone. You're wrong, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity and strength that silenced the onlookers who had gathered to watch the drama. I was never nothing. My mistake was thinking I needed your name to be something. The truth, Richard, is that you were the one who needed me. And then Adrian delivered the killing blow. She's right, you know, he said, a look of clinical pity on his face. Take the Ato Corp deal in Japan. You lost nearly $1 billion in projected revenue because you and your associate... He glanced dismissively at Chloe, who was hovering nearby. Managed to offend Mr. Tanaka by presenting him with a gift using your left hand. A catastrophic insult. Richard stared at him, bewildered. How could you possibly know that? Because Isabella told me, Adrian said. She told me that Mr. Tanaka was a stickler for traditional etiquette. She told me his wife was an admirer of the 18th century ceramicist Otagaki Rengetsu. So when I met with him last week, I presented Mrs. Tanaka with a rare Rengetsu tea bowl, using my right hand, of course. Thorn Ventures signed an exclusive partnership with Ito Corp yesterday morning. It would seem Isabella's cute hobby of understanding culture just made my company $1 billion. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face ashen. All this time he had been failing without understanding why. It was her. It had always been her. Her quiet intelligence, her social grace, her invisible hand guiding his success. As his world tilted on its axis, the final twist of the knife came from an unexpected source. A flustered-looking man in a tuxedo, one of Richard's board members, rushed over, grabbing his arm. "Richard, thank God I found you," the man said, his voice a panicked whisper. "We have a massive problem. There's been a data breach. Someone on the inside has been leaking our Q4 earnings projections and sensitive negotiation strategies to Morgan Stanley for weeks. The SEC just launched a formal investigation." Richard looked utterly lost. But Isabella's mind, now honed by months of analytical work, made the connection instantly. She looked past Richard to where Chloe was standing. The younger woman's face was pale with terror. She was discreetly trying to slip her phone into her purse, but not before Isabella saw the Morgan Stanley logo on an open email app. Chloe, the ultimate opportunist, had been selling him out, hedging her bets for when his empire finally crumbled. Isabella looked at Richard, a defeated, bewildered man betrayed by the woman for whom he had destroyed his own marriage and outmaneuvered by the wife he had so arrogantly discarded. There was no triumph in her heart, no joy in his destruction. There was only a quiet, sad finality. "It appears you have bigger problems than my choice of evening wear, Richard," she said softly. Turning her back on the ruins of her former husband, she took Adrian's arm. "I believe I've had enough of this party. Shall we go?" As they walked away, leaving Richard to face the implosion of his company. And his life, Isabella did not look back. The implosion of Richard Beaumont's world was not a single clean explosion, but a slow, grinding collapse. The story of Chloe Sterling's corporate espionage, a betrayal so brazen it became a case study in business schools, was the initial detonation. But the shrapnel that followed was relentless. The SEC investigation froze his assets. The board of Beaumont Holdings, a collection of men he'd always considered his loyal lieutenants, turned on him with the swift, impersonal viciousness of a predator sensing a fatal wound. The emergency board meeting was held in the familiar 80th floor conference room, a space where Richard had brokered billion-dollar deals and crushed countless competitors. But that day, he was the one being crushed. He watched the faces around the polished mahogany table faces that had once laughed at his jokes and sought his approval and saw only cool, hard calculation. His blustering defense was met with stony silence. His threats were met with pitying glances. When the final vote of no confidence was cast a unanimous decision, it felt less like a betrayal and more like an inevitability. The final page of a book he hadn't realized he was writing. He was escorted from the building by security, his access badge deactivated before he even reached the lobby. The empire his grandfather had built, the one he had ruled with an iron fist, had locked its doors to him. His descent was a spectacle. He retreated to the cavernous Park Avenue penthouse, but the silence within its walls was more deafening than the roar of the city outside. His calls to former allies went to voicemail. His invitations were regretfully declined. He was a king without a kingdom, a ghost rattling around a museum of his former life. The tabloids which had once documented his every triumph now chronicled his every stumble. They printed long-lens photos of him on his balcony, unshaven and hollow-eyed, a modern-day Lear raging against a storm of his own making. The world he had commanded had not only forgotten him, it was actively erasing him. In stark contrast, Isabella's world was expanding in every direction. The Thorn Foundation was no longer a nascent project, but a cultural powerhouse. Under her directorship, they had successfully authenticated and acquired a breathtaking portrait by Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, a piece long thought lost. At the press conference announcing the acquisition, Isabella spoke with an eloquence and passion that captivated the art world. She wasn't just a director, she was a storyteller, breathing life back into the forgotten legacies of brilliant women. Forbes featured her on their 40 over 40 list, not as a socialite or a comeback story, but as a visionary shaping the future of art. Her relationship with Adrian Thorne had deepened into a partnership that was as intellectually stimulating as it was emotionally fulfilling. They were equals in every sense. They would spend long evenings in the Foundation's private library, debating the nuances of a new acquisition or planning their next ambitious project. It was a love built not on power dynamics or public performance, but on quiet conversations, shared laughter, and a profound mutual respect. He admired her mind and her resilience. She loved his integrity and the way his eyes lit up when she explained the history of a particular brushstroke. It was a love that was calm, steady, and real. When the news of the court-ordered bankruptcy auction of Richard's personal effects was made public, Isabella felt a complex pang of emotions. There was no triumphant glee, no sense of vindication. There was only a quiet, somber ache for the man he might have been, and for the years she had lost trying to find him. Adrian saw the news on his tablet and looked over at her, his expression unreadable. "A final chapter," he said softly. "I suppose so." she replied, her gaze distant. She had no intention of going. It felt ghoulish, like attending an estate sale for a life she had once shared. But that evening, while browsing the online catalogue out of a morbid curiosity, she saw it. Lot 47B, A View of the Grand Canal, by Canaletto. The painting wasn't the most valuable piece in the collection, nor the most famous, but it was the one piece that held a sliver of the real Richard the boy he'd been before ambition had calcified his heart. It had hung in the library of his family's Connecticut estate, and he had once confessed to her, during a rare, unguarded moment early in their marriage, that as a lonely child, he would sit and stare into its sun-drenched Venetian world for hours, finding a peace there that his own life lacked. It was the only object he'd ever loved without considering its monetary value. A sudden, clear resolve formed in her mind. This wasn't about Richard. This was about legacy and the quiet dignity that even a fallen man deserved. The auction at Sotheby's was a somber affair, a room full of vultures picking over the carcass of a lion. Isabella slipped into a seat in the back row, wearing a simple black dress and dark glasses, drawing no attention to herself. She watched as Richard's life was sold off piece by piece. His custom. Patek Philippe. Watch his fleet of supercars, the garish jewelry he had bought for Chloe. All of it went under the hammer, each sale punctuated by the sharp, final crack of the auctioneer's gavel. Finally, Lot 47B was brought onto the stage. The Canaletto seemed to radiate a gentle, golden light, a pocket of serene beauty amidst the cold transactionalism of the room. The bidding started low. Then a man in the front row, a notoriously ruthless hedge fund manager named Marcus Blackwood, who was known for buying the assets of his vanquished rivals as trophies, began to bid. He did it with a smug, theatrical flair, clearly enjoying the symbolism of acquiring the last remnant of the Beaumont family's heritage. The other bidders quickly dropped out, unwilling to challenge him. The auctioneer began his final call. Going once, going twice. Isabella felt a stillness settle over her. This wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. Not his, but hers. It was about choosing grace in a world that had shown her none. Just as the hammer was about to fall, she raised her paddle. A collective murmur rippled through the auction house. Heads turned. Marcus Blackwood shot an irritated glance over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place the woman in the back row. He sneered and signaled a higher bid. Isabella, her expression placid, calmly countered. The duel began. The price climbed, soaring past the painting's estimate. The room was silent, all eyes on the two bidders. It was a battle of wills, a clash of two different worlds. His bidding was aggressive, fueled by ego and the desire to dominate. Her bidding was quiet, calm, and implacable. Blackwood was buying a trophy. She was saving a memory. Finally, with the price at a staggering figure, Blackwood, red-faced and frustrated by her refusal to be intimidated, threw his hands up in defeat. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his voice ringing with excitement as he pointed his gavel towards her. "To the lady in the back." A week later, a plain, unmarked van pulled up to a discreet, high-end rehabilitation center in the rolling hills of Connecticut. A large, securely wrapped package was delivered to the front desk with instructions to give it to their newest resident. In a small, Spartan room, the man who was once Richard Beaumont accepted the package. He was thinner now, the arrogance stripped from his features, leaving behind a weary, haunted emptiness. He assumed it was from his lawyers, another document to sign another piece of his old life being legally severed. He tore away the wrapping with listless fingers, and then he froze. It was the Canaletto, the familiar sunlit vista of Venice, the scene of his only childhood solace. He ran a trembling hand over the ornate frame, his mind reeling in confusion. Who would do this? Why? He carefully lifted the painting, and as he turned it over, a small cream-colored envelope fell to the floor. He picked it up. There was no name, no sender. Inset on a simple card were 3 words written in the elegant, perfect script he knew as well as his own. Everyone deserves peace. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, ragged sob that seemed to tear its way up from the very depths of his soul. He sank to his knees, clutching the painting to his chest, and the carefully constructed dams he had built around his heart for a lifetime finally broke. He wept. He wept for his own breathtaking arrogance, for his cruelty, for his blindness. He wept for the quiet, brilliant woman he had shattered and discarded, the one person who, after everything, had reached back through the wreckage of his life, not to gloat, but to offer him this one final impossible act of grace. In that small, sterile room, holding the ghost of his past, Richard Beaumont was finally, truly alone with the man he had become. Thousands of miles away on a stone terrace overlooking the shimmering expanse of Lake Como, Isabella stood with Adrian. The Thorn Foundation had just successfully launched its first international symposium in Milan. The evening air was soft-scented with night-blooming jasmine. Adrian wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Are you happy, Isabella?" he asked quietly. She leaned back against him, looking out at the last embers of sunset, painting the water in strokes of liquid gold. She thought of the woman who had stood alone on the steps of the Met, a creature of midnight blue and broken dreams. She thought of the scholar in the salt-weathered cottage, rediscovering her voice. And she thought of the queen in the golden gown, reclaiming her power. They were all parts of her, a tapestry woven from sorrow and strength. "I am," she said, her voice clear and sure. "I am at peace." The victory wasn't in Richard's fall or in her own rise. The victory was in this moment, the quiet strength to close a painful chapter with compassion instead of vengeance. She had won the war not by destroying her enemy, but by refusing to become him. She had saved the last piece of his legacy not for him, but for herself, a final definitive act of closing the door on the past, so she could fully and freely step into her brilliant future. The story of Isabella Rossi is a powerful reminder that our lowest moments do not have to define us. It's a testament to the fact that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about how we rise. She transformed public humiliation into personal triumph, not through bitter revenge, but by rediscovering her passion and reclaiming her own identity. Her journey from a discarded wife to a celebrated leader shows us that our greatest comeback is often rooted in the talents we've been told to hide. If Isabella's story of resilience and empowerment resonated with you, please help us share it with others who might need to hear it. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with your friends and family. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories of incredible transformation and sweet, sweet karma. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening. Have you ever heard the kind of story that makes your heart twist into knots, an impossible betrayal that strips away the very foundation of love and leaves you breathless? Imagine a young wife, pregnant and terrified, cast out onto the streets by the very man who once pledged to protect her. Now envision that same man, a billionaire tycoon idolized by the media standing trial in a courtroom packed with reporters and skeptics. This isn't just a story about broken vows. It's about shocking truths, shattered empires, and a fight for justice against all odds. Ready to witness the downfall of a modern titan, Elara, Caldwell was not born into wealth. She had in fact grown up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston. Her father, a carpenter, and her mother, a schoolteacher, had worked tirelessly to put food on the table and instill in her the values of perseverance and empathy. Elara spent her childhood days reading books in the local library, dreaming of a future filled with love and stability. She often wondered if the fairy tales she devoured held a grain of truth, that somewhere out there a prince waited to whisk her away. At 25, she believed she'd found that prince in Xavier Caldwell, though few outside his circles knew his real name then. He was famously reclusive, with a near mythical status among venture capitalists. Newspapers and magazines identified him as a brilliant maverick, following in the footsteps of visionary moguls like Elon Musk and Bill Gates. Xavier, however, seemed different, quieter, more introspective, but commanding a presence that filled any room. Their whirlwind romance began when Elara was invited to a charity gala by a friend who thought she needed some excitement in her life. She had never stepped foot into such an opulent venue. Crystal chandeliers, gold-lined pillars, and the hum of classical music swirling in the background. Xavier spotted Elara in a corner, nursing a glass of sparkling water. His first words to her were disarmingly simple. "I'm Xavier. You look like you're about to run for the door." A short conversation turned into an hour, then two. He was unlike anyone Elara had ever met, polished, articulate, and impossibly wealthy. Yet it was his vulnerability that drew her in. He spoke of big dreams, building a tech empire that would reshape global commerce, revolutionizing e-commerce platforms, AI, real estate, you name it. But he also confessed a relentless loneliness, a burden that came with the kind of success that turned friends into opportunists and family into distant acquaintances. Their courtship was rapid. Within months, Xavier proposed in front of a small gathering at a beach house in Malibu. The sky had blushed with pastel hues of pink and orange as he knelt on one knee. Though they'd been together for only a short while, she accepted. The ring was a symbol of his wealth, a flawless diamond that sparkled like a star. But Elara told herself it was the man, not the money, that captured her heart. They married quietly. No prying eyes, no paparazzi. Just a simple ceremony held in Xavier's garden, where he promised her a life of comfort, love, and partnership. He insisted that their union was more than just an alliance of convenience. He swore she was the missing piece to his restless soul. For a fleeting moment, Elara felt like the happiest woman in the world. But from the outset, something in Xavier's world felt controlled, orchestrated, as if the man behind the empire always needed to maintain the upper hand. Friends often joked that he was a chess grandmaster in business, adept at anticipating moves 5 steps ahead of his competitors. It turned out he played the same cunning game in his personal life. Though blissful at first, Elara gradually found cracks in this perfect marriage. She noticed how staff tiptoed around Xavier, their eyes perpetually glued to the floor, as if any misstep would trigger dire consequences. She saw the glances he exchanged with his chief financial officer, the suspiciously locked doors to certain home offices she was forbidden to enter, and the hush that fell whenever his phone rang from unknown numbers. Then came the day that changed her life forever, when she discovered she was pregnant. She had been overjoyed imagining a child who would unite them more deeply, a chance for both of them to experience unconditional love. But the moment she told Xavier, his reaction was muted. He offered her a stiff embrace, congratulated her, and then excused himself to make a call. That moment planted the first seed of doubt in Ilara's mind about whether she truly belonged in his carefully constructed world. What she never could have predicted was that Xavier was about to dismantle her life with the cold detachment of a man closing out a failed business deal. Their marriage might have been a union of hearts for her, but for him, it was turning into something else entirely. A week after Ilara's pregnancy test, she woke up to an unsettling silence. Typically, Xavier's personal chef would be bustling in the kitchen, preparing elaborate breakfasts. His driver, Mikhail, would already be waiting outside black SUV, polished to a shine, ready to whisk Xavier off to his office. There would be staff scurrying around, tidying, dusting, fluffing pillows. Yet on this morning, the house was so quiet that Ilara could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Cautiously, she navigated the marble-floored corridors. The luxurious home, typically buzzing with controlled commotion, felt as vacant as an abandoned museum. She passed by the large portrait of Xavier's late mother, a philanthropic icon once recognized by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The eyes in the painting seemed to follow her, almost pitying her confusion. She reached the kitchen to find the place deserted. A single note lay atop the counter. The message in neat calligraphy read, "Madame, we have been instructed to cease our duties until further notice. We wish you well." It was signed by head butler Robert, a man who had always shown Ilara kindness. Heart-pounding, Ilara raced to Xavier's home office, one of the few rooms not locked. She found it stripped of nearly everything. Only an empty desk remained where a half-dozen monitors once glowed. The shelves which held thick portfolios and international business contracts were bare. All that remained was a single sealed envelope addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was from Xavier's legal counsel, not from Xavier himself. It spoke in formal, frigid language. Effective immediately. All marital obligations are suspended. Mrs. Caldwell is advised to vacate the premises. Further communication will be handled through my office. She read the paragraphs in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the meaning of these words with the man she'd called husband. Her mind raced. Perhaps Xavier was in trouble. Maybe he had to flee the country on urgent business, or maybe he was protecting her from something. She tried to muster any scenario that would make sense beyond the plain meaning of those letters that her husband was effectively kicking her out, pregnant and alone. In a panic, she made calls to Xavier's personal phone, his CFO, even the receptionist at his corporate headquarters. She was met by either silence, disconnected lines, or vague responses. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Caldwell isn't available." She found her personal belongings, clothes, keepsakes, even her wedding ring neatly packed in suitcases and stacked near the entrance. Next to them lay an eviction notice stamped with official seals. She crumpled to the floor in disbelief. How could a man she loved, someone who said he needed her, push her away in such a cruel, calculated manner? Desperation led her to dial old acquaintances, but her calls went straight to voicemail. Over the past months, she had isolated herself at Xavier's request. She'd abandoned her job, discontinued her lease on her old apartment, drifted away from her friends. Even her parents were halfway around the world, temporarily residing in France to care for a sick relative. She was in short alone, in a city that revered her husband as a tech luminary and philanthropic genius with no one to turn to. Soon security guards arrived, men she recognized from the estate's perimeter. They politely but firmly escorted her out. No violence, no shouting, just the sort of business-like efficiency that had always characterized Xavier's dealings. Within minutes, Elara stood on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. The gates to the Caldwell mansion closed behind her with a final resounding click. She stared at the grand facade, tears streaming down her face, uncertain of how she would survive the day, let alone care for the child growing inside her. In that single morning, Elara realized she was being treated not as a wife, but as a cast-off accessory to be disposed of. Her heartbreak quickly morphed into shock, then desperation. This was a world that worshipped Xavier's intellect and philanthropic gestures. Who would even believe that he would do something so vile? She glanced at her phone full battery, yet no calls or texts. She gazed at her wedding band, ironically symbolizing unity and devotion, now just a cold piece of metal on her finger. Her mind swirled with questions she couldn't answer. Why had he cast her aside? Was it because of the pregnancy? Had she unwittingly sabotaged one of his grand plans by expecting a child? She had no illusions about the precariousness of her position. She was pregnant, homeless, and financially cut off from the man the world hailed as a billionaire savant. Still in shock, Elara dialed the only place she could think to go, a run-down motel on the other side of the city, where she had once stayed briefly during a job transition. She had little money, only what remained in her personal checking account. She flagged a taxi and gave the address. As she rode away from the mansion, the tears kept rolling, fueled by confusion, fear, and a profound sense of betrayal. Yet a tiny voice inside her kept repeating, "Stay strong for your child." She clung to that determination. She might be alone for now, but she wouldn't let her unborn baby become a casualty of Xavier's cruelty. That resolve would see her through what was to come, though she had no idea how twisted the path ahead would become. The motel Elara checked into was a stark contrast to the luxury she'd just been exiled from, peeling wallpaper, stale air, and a room barely larger than a closet. Still in shock, she sat on the worn bed, clutching her prenatal vitamins like a lifeline. Everything she'd believed in her home, her marriage, had vanished overnight. She forced herself to eat a peanut butter sandwich made from a few groceries she could afford. Each bite reminded her she had to stay strong for her unborn child. The news that night made it worse. Xavier was on TV smiling, promoting a new tech venture. No mention of his pregnant wife, now sleeping on a lumpy mattress in a budget motel. The next day, with no support and limited funds, Elara searched for help. She remembered Harriet Macmillan, a lawyer she'd met briefly at one of Xavier's events. Grasping at hope, she left a voicemail. "Please, I need help. I have nowhere else to turn." With that message, Elara began to fight not just for survival, but for justice. 2 days later, Elara was finishing a cup of lukewarm tea in her cramped motel room when her phone buzzed. She nearly dropped it in her haste to answer. A cool, professional voice came through. "This is Harriet Macmillan, returning your call." "Elara, isn't it?" Relief flooded Elara. She briefly recapped her situation, trying to keep her voice steady. Harriet listened intently, only interrupting to ask clarifying questions about the timeline, the nature of the eviction, and whether Elara had any prenuptial agreements. Finally, Harriet spoke, her tone measured but firm. "I'd like to meet with you in person. My office is in downtown Boston. Bring any documents you have." Elara's finances were in dire straits, but Harriet insisted that the first consultation was free, gathering her courage and her legal papers. Mainly the marriage certificate, a copy of the eviction notice, and the letter from Xavier's counsel, Ilara made her way downtown. The ride on public transportation took nearly an hour, weaving through the bustling city that felt so alien now, considering her recent eviction from a life of privilege. Harriet's office sat in a sleek, modern building. Ilara's nerves intensified as she stepped inside, worried that everyone would see her as a penniless cast-off. But Harriet herself greeted Ilara in the waiting area with a warm handshake. She was a tall woman, with sharp features exuding an air of unwavering confidence. Her short-cropped hair and tailored pantsuit suggested someone who thrived in the corporate world, a far cry from the disheveled, frightened person Ilara felt like at that moment. In a private conference room, Harriet laid out a notepad and began to ask more detailed questions. She didn't flinch when Ilara described how Xavier had locked up entire sections of the house, or how the staff had mysteriously vanished. She jotted down notes in a decisive manner and asked follow-ups about anything that seemed unclear. "What about your prenuptial agreement? Do you recall any clauses about children or spousal support?" Harriet asked, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose. Ilara shook her head. We didn't sign one. It seemed unromantic, and Xavier said he trusted me completely." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "No prenuptial agreement." "Interesting. That can work in your favor." She glanced at the letter from Xavier's attorney. "This is unusual. He's essentially cut you off financially and you're pregnant. That's going to look terrible for him if this goes to court. We need to move quickly, but he's so powerful." Ilara murmured, her voice trembling. "He's got an entire legal team on retainer." "I've got nothing." Harriet leaned forward. "I'll be candid, this won't be easy, but I've gone up against big players before. Xavier's trying to act as if you don't exist. That's not going to fly, especially given your pregnancy. Family law tends to favor the well-being of the child." Her confidence injected a sliver of hope into Ilara's battered spirit. They discussed strategies, filing a motion for spousal support, ensuring Ilara had medical coverage, demanding an injunction to prevent Xavier from dissipating assets. Harriet's voice was calm, like a lighthouse beacon in a storm. However, Harriet also cautioned that Xavier would almost certainly fight back. He might attempt to paint Ilara as an opportunist or claim she'd violated some aspect of their arrangement. "We should prepare for the mudslinging," Harriet said grimly. "I've seen men like Xavier do anything to protect their reputation." Before Ilara left, Harriet handed her a pamphlet listing supportive services for pregnant women, including a few discreet shelters that might provide better accommodations than a run-down motel. "Try them," she suggested, "and keep every receipt, every text message, every bit of correspondence. We'll need it all." As Ilara walked out of the gleaming office building, a wave of determination rolled over her. She wasn't fighting only for herself anymore. This was about her child. Harriet's willingness to stand up to a titan of industry was a lifeline. Her steps felt a little surer as she navigated the crowded sidewalks, heading back to the motel to gather her things. That night, she moved into a small women's shelter Harriet had recommended. She shared a room with 2 other expectant mothers, neither of whom knew her story, nor did they ask. The place was clean, staffed by volunteers and social workers with genuine concern in their eyes. Here, Ilara no longer felt hounded by the shadows of her old life. Though it was still a far cry from the luxuries, she once had a sense of community and comfort began to form. She stayed up late, scribbling down any details that might help her case. The secrets in the Caldwell mansion, the suspicious phone calls, the staff's abrupt departure. She recounted Xavier's strange behavior after she announced her pregnancy. Everything down to the smallest detail might matter. As the clock ticked past midnight, she felt a flicker of hope. Harriet believed in her case. Maybe a judge would too. But deep down she sensed that Xavier wouldn't let her off that easily. A man who built an empire by outmaneuvering everyone in business wouldn't just yield in the face of a legal fight. The stakes were about to get even higher and more dangerous. The seeds of a coming storm were planted, and Elara braced herself for whatever chaos was about to unfold. The first court hearing took place on a brisk grey morning. Clouds loomed overhead, as if reflecting Elara's somber mood. She arrived with Harriet by her side, gripping a binder of documents so tightly her knuckles turned white. In the hallway, she caught a glimpse of Xavier for the first time since her eviction. Dressed in a bespoke suit, he cut an imposing figure, scanning the crowd with calm indifference. Their eyes met only briefly, and a wave of nausea hit Elara. Not just from her pregnancy, but from the magnitude of his betrayal. As the hearing commenced, Harriet outlined the basic facts. Elara was pregnant, with no income evicted from her marital home. She sought temporary spousal support and medical coverage. The opposing counsel, a polished man named Douglas Hargraves, argued that Elara had voluntarily vacated the premises. He even claimed she had adequate financial resources and that the pregnancy was not conclusively verified. At that, Elara's mouth fell open. Not conclusively verified. She had medical records, ultrasound images, everything. Harriet quickly produced evidence of her pregnancy test results and an OB-GYN's report, effectively shutting down Hargraves's smirking insinuation. The judge, a stern but seemingly fair woman named Judge Helena Connors, frowned at Hargraves's tactics and instructed both parties to focus on the matter at hand. The hearing concluded with Judge Connors granting Elara a modest monthly stipend for her living expenses until the next court date, as well as ordering Xavier's insurance to cover her prenatal care. A small victory, but enough to lift Elara's spirits. Harriet whispered, "We'll build from here," as they left the courtroom. But the fight was far from over. Over the next few weeks, Harriet discovered a labyrinth of corporate entities and trusts behind Xavier's empire. Shares were distributed among shell companies. Real estate holdings were in offshore accounts, and assets shifted daily. It was a puzzle only a skilled financial sleuth could decode. Xavier was clearly trying to bury any semblance of personal wealth behind complex legal structures, so Elara would have little to claim. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the hearing. Headlines emerged, "Philanthropic tech mogul's marital troubles," but the coverage remained sympathetic to Xavier. Gossip blogs speculated that Elara was a gold digger seeking a quick payout. Social media erupted with rumors that she'd been unfaithful. Strangers hurled insults at her, online calling her manipulative or labeling her pregnancy a trap. The onslaught of negativity stung especially when she was already feeling vulnerable. Harriet advised Elara to stay off social media. "People are going to have opinions," she said kindly, "and they'll make up stories to entertain themselves. Focus on what matters, building our legal case and taking care of your health." Despite the emotional toll, Elara pressed on. She found a part-time job typing transcripts for a small publishing company, just enough to keep herself busy and earn a little money. She spent evenings combing through any records she could find that might tie Xavier's personal fortune to his corporate accounts. The more she discovered, the more her sense of betrayal grew. The entire marriage felt like a carefully orchestrated sham. It wasn't just that she had lost her home. She had lost her faith in the man she believed she knew. Occasionally, she'd have fleeting memories of tender moments with Xavier, like the time they slow danced in the moonlight on the balcony of a Tuscan villa during their brief honeymoon. Or the time he lovingly prepared her favorite dish, spinach lasagna, and teased her about her horrible taste in reality TV shows. These recollections haunted her dreams at night, leaving her questioning how a man capable of such warmth could turn so cold. One afternoon, Harriet invited a forensic accountant named Samson Armitage to their meeting. Samson was a soft-spoken man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a knack for unraveling financial mysteries. He greeted Elara politely, then opened a thick file. "We've found some anomalies." He began showing them charts of transactions that zigzagged across continents. "There are large sums moving to and from trusts in the Cayman Islands, the Isle of Man, and Luxembourg. Likely more. Caldwell Industries is also funneling money into partnerships that are 90% owned by Xavier Caldwell himself, but are named under shell entities." Elara's stomach churned. She realized that even if she won a court ruling, collecting anything from Xavier might be an immorally different matter. He was layering his assets with such complexity that prying them free would be akin to scaling an endless mountain. Harriet, however, was undeterred. "We'll build a narrative," she told Elara. "Judges hate it when wealthy spouses hide assets. It offends the court's sense of fairness. If we can document how Xavier is shifting money around, we'll strengthen your claim." That evening, Elara returned to the shelter, exhausted, but somewhat hopeful. She had Harriet Sampson and a small team of paralegals working tirelessly to illuminate the truth. Although the media storm raged on, Elara was learning that public opinion ebbs and flows. The courts at least required evidence, not hearsay. She reminded herself, "Stay strong, protect your child, fight for justice." The legal labyrinth was complex and daunting, but she vowed not to let Xavier's empire crush her without a fight. Step by step, she was inching forward, fueled by a mixture of determination and maternal instinct. The next courtroom battle would be the true test of her resolve, and maybe, just maybe, the key to unraveling Xavier's carefully guarded secrets. The next few weeks brought an unsettling tension to Elara's life. Though she continued to live at the shelter and work part-time each day, felt like walking through a minefield. On the surface, she was coping, eating as well as she could, attending prenatal checkups, and meeting regularly with Harriet. But underneath a low-grade dread shadowed her every move. She'd seen the depths of Xavier's ruthlessness, and she had no illusions that he'd remain passive. Sure enough, the rumor mill churned faster. Speculative tabloids picked up a mysterious story. Billionaire's wife, linked to former flame, accompanied by grainy photos of Elara from years ago, standing beside an ex-boyfriend at a college party. The piece insinuated that the child might not be Xavier's. Even more disturbing were mentions of discovered diaries, where Elara allegedly penned fantasies of wealth and social climbing. The diaries, of course, were entirely fabricated, and Harriet moved swiftly to issue a cease and desist. But the damage was done. In the court of public opinion, where sensational headlines thrive, the story gained traction. Elara's stress soared. She worried that even if these rumors were false, the courts might be swayed by the surrounding noise. Harriet, sensing her fear, reassured her that real judges require credible evidence, not tabloid gossip. "But it's not just about the law," Harriet lamented. "Xavier knows how to manipulate narratives. We've got to stay vigilant." Meanwhile, Samson continued dissecting Xavier's financial labyrinth. He discovered that Caldwell Industries had recently launched a major philanthropic initiative, a $200 million donation to a global education fund publicly lauded by high-profile figures, including Warren Buffett. The news overshadowed the scandalous rumors painting Xavier as a benevolent philanthropist. Elara recognized this as a well-timed publicity stunt, possibly orchestrated to steer attention away from her pending lawsuit. Still, she found allies in unexpected places. A journalist named Martin Ross from the Boston Herald approached her discreetly, claiming he had evidence of corporate malfeasance within Caldwell Industries. Over a coffee in a quiet cafe, Martin confided that rumors of insider trading and shady mergers had been circulating for months. "I can't print anything yet," he said, sipping his coffee. "But if I get something solid, I'll blow this wide open." Elara was wary. She didn't trust easily anymore, especially not journalists, given the tabloids' treatment of her story. But Martin handed her a business card and said, "If you learn anything that ties Caldwell to these alleged crimes, call me. We both want the truth." She tucked the card into her pocket, unsure if she'd ever use it. However, part of her wondered if shining a light on Xavier's potential illegal activities might be the leverage she needed in family court. Though Harriet had warned her that going public could complicate matters, especially if Xavier retaliated, the possibility lingered in the back of Elara's mind. One morning, Harriet invited her to a strategy session in the same conference room they often used. Samson was there, as well as Harriet's paralegal Tina. The atmosphere was tense. Harriet cut to the chase. "We need to present a compelling case that Xavier is using fraudulent means to hide his marital assets. With the evidence Samson has gathered so far, we can request a subpoena for additional financial records." Samson chimed in, "We'll need forensic imaging of certain computers and servers. If the court grants it, we'll have a better chance of uncovering how he's diverting funds." Elara nodded, though she felt overwhelmed. "And then what?" Harriet exhaled. "Then we confront him in court. He either opens the books or he faces judicial penalties. But don't forget, he'll throw everything he has at us. His lawyers, the media, public opinion. This is going to be war." Despite the looming battle, Elara felt a spark of gratitude for Harriet and Samson's dedication. She couldn't have imagined a more committed team. They could have easily dismissed her case, seeing it as too risky or not lucrative enough. But something about her plight, perhaps the moral imperative to protect a pregnant woman from an unfeeling billionaire, kept them invested. Later that evening, back at the shelter, Elara found a moment of relative peace in the lounge area, sipping chamomile tea. A faint kick in her abdomen made her smile. The baby was growing stronger every day, and so was she in a way she'd never expected. She was standing up against one of the most powerful men in the city, maybe even the world, and she was still here, still fighting. Yet a disturbing thought crept in. If Xavier was capable of fabricating diaries and spinning rumors to discredit her, what else could he do? The next move might be even more devastating. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the other women in the shelter, her mind wrestled with a single question. How far would Xavier go to protect his empire? And would she and her unborn child survive the fallout? Weeks turned into months, and Elara's pregnancy advanced. Her belly was now visibly round, a reminder of the life pulsing within her. She tried to find solace in each gentle flutter and kick forging a bond with her unborn child. Yet the legal and emotional battles showed no sign of relenting. Harriet had filed a motion for a more thorough financial disclosure from Xavier. The court responded by scheduling a major hearing, one that could force Xavier to submit detailed records. Xavier's legal team objected vehemently, claiming it was an invasion of privacy, but Judge Connors appeared unconvinced by their arguments. The stage was set for a legal showdown. One evening, Harriet called Alara at the shelter voice, crackling with urgency. "You need to come to my office. Samson discovered something big." Heart pounding. Alara hopped into an Uber and arrived at Harriet's building under a canopy of streetlights. She found Harriet, Samson, and Tina huddled around a laptop in the conference room, eyes locked on the screen. Samson beckoned her closer. "We've been sorting through some obscure corporate filings from Caldwell's affiliated companies," he began. "Look at this." On the screen were documents revealing that a subset of Caldwell Industries, an AI research lab, had received massive funding through shell companies registered in Belize. Attached were email exchanges, presumably between Xavier and his CFO, discussing off-the-books transactions, bribes to foreign officials for favorable contracts, and labyrinthine routing of funds to avoid taxes. Alara's jaw dropped. "Is all of this illegal?" Samson nodded gravely. "Potentially very. This suggests money laundering and bribery under the guise of tech investments. It's beyond just hiding money from you. It's criminal misconduct." Harriet frowned. "We can use this as leverage. If we present this in family court, it could undermine his credibility and force him to comply with asset disclosure. But we have to be extremely cautious. If we hand this over to law enforcement or the media prematurely, it could compromise your divorce case, or it could vanish." Alara felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Vindication, fear, and an overwhelming sense of just how deep Xavier's corruption might go. She thought of Martin Ross, the investigative journalist, and his hints about corporate wrongdoing. This evidence could confirm his suspicions and blow open a massive scandal. But was it worth the risk to her personal case? Harriet went on. "If we can tie these funds directly to Xavier, he'll have no choice but to negotiate. He wouldn't want these details to come out in open court, let alone in a criminal investigation. It might force him to settle generously." Yet Alara's conscience flared. She wasn't just fighting a personal battle. Lives could be impacted if Caldwell Industries was built on dirty money. Did she owe it to the public to expose him? Samson tried to reassure her. "Remember, your priority is ensuring financial security for you and your child. But if we do go public, you're absolutely going to become a target. This is bigger than a messy divorce. We're talking about an empire that could come crashing down," Tina added softly. "And if we don't use it carefully, Xavier's lawyers will claim we obtained this illegally or tampered with it. We need to dot every I and cross every T. If there's any chance the documents are admissible, we have to follow proper procedures." Alara felt dizzy. She was pregnant, homeless, battling relentless rumors, and now she held the power to reveal a global scandal. She grabbed a chair to steady herself, taking deep breaths. In the short term, Harriet and Samson agreed to secure the documents, while planning the next legal steps. Meanwhile, Harriet advised Alara to remain vigilant. "If Xavier finds out we have this, he'll do anything to stop us." That night, Alara slept fitfully, images of corporate espionage and shady deals swirling in her mind. She recalled the early days of their marriage, how Xavier would spend long nights in his office, murmuring on phone calls in languages she didn't understand, always quick to close his laptop when she entered. Suddenly, all those small, odd moments crystallized. She'd been living alongside a man with hidden depths of corruption. As dawn broke, she resolved that if exposing Xavier's criminal activities could protect her child's future and bring some semblance of justice, she had to see it through. The next courtroom hearing wasn't just a step in a divorce proceeding. It was a fuse leading to a potential explosion that might consume Xavier's entire empire, and she had the matches. With her belly growing by the day and her spirit hardened by betrayal, she prepared for a fight that could change her life and possibly the world beyond it. The day of the major court hearing dawned cool and clear, an odd contrast to the storm of anticipation Elara felt inside. She arrived with Harriet and Samson, each lugging boxes of meticulously organized documents. Outside the courthouse, a throng of reporters snapped photos and shouted questions. Elara kept her head down, her heart hammering against her rib cage as she navigated past the flashing cameras and swirling microphones. Xavier appeared calm and unhurried, flanked by his legal team. He cut an almost regal figure in a midnight blue suit, responding to reporters' questions with clipped politeness, dismissing the case as a private family matter. But Elara sensed an undercurrent of tension in his posture. Perhaps he suspected the bombshell Harriet was about to drop. Judge Connors presided, her face stern, as she called the proceedings to order. Harriet began by reiterating Elara's request for full financial disclosure. Hargraves, Xavier's lawyer, retorted that they had already provided sufficient documents. Harriet, however, wasn't deterred. "We have reason to believe Xavier Caldwell has substantial assets hidden in offshore accounts," Harriet stated, her voice resonating through the silent courtroom. She produced a series of exhibits referencing suspicious wire transfers, shell companies, and the pattern of bribes. The tension in the room escalated palpably. Xavier's expression hardened. Hargraves immediately objected, claiming these documents were obtained illegally, lacking proper authentication. The judge studied the material, occasionally glancing at Harriet over the rim of her glasses. Harriet responded, "Your Honor, we are prepared to authenticate these documents via a forensic accountant's affidavit." Samson rose and solemnly swore that he had compiled the evidence using legitimate research methods and public filings. Harriet continued, "In light of these revelations, we ask the court to compel Mr. Caldwell to produce complete financial records, including all corporate accounts in which he holds a controlling interest." Judge Connors took a moment to peruse the evidence. The gravity of the accusations, money laundering, bribery, asset concealment, was not lost on her. She looked to Xavier's side. "Mr. Hargraves, your client's response?" Hargraves shifted uncomfortably. "We dispute the authenticity of these documents and the inferences Ms. Macmillan is drawing. These are baseless allegations designed to smear my client. We request a postponement to allow our own forensic experts to review." Harriet shot back. "Meanwhile, my client continues to be denied rightful financial support. We request an immediate court order for provisional access to funds given the high likelihood of Mr. Caldwell's concealment." Elara watched Xavier's face contort ever so slightly. She'd seen that look before, a mixture of anger and fear, a crack in his calm facade. He leaned toward Hargraves and whispered urgently. Judge Connors tapped her gavel, demanding order. After a tense back and forth, the judge made her ruling. "I will order a thorough independent audit of Mr. Caldwell's finances, with full cooperation required. Additionally, given the plausible evidence of asset concealment, I'm granting an increased temporary spousal support for Mrs. Caldwell to ensure her well-being throughout her pregnancy. The matter of final distribution of marital assets will be determined once the audit is complete." The gallery erupted in hushed murmurs. For Elara, it felt like the first major victory. Official acknowledgement that Xavier might be hiding significant wealth and that she was entitled to more support. Harriet squeezed her hand reassuringly under the table. Xavier stood abruptly as the hearing adjourned. He shot a glare at Elara across the courtroom, a glare that promised retaliation. Hargraves tried to placate him, but he brushed his lawyer aside and strode out, cameras flashing in his wake. Outside reporters swarmed Elara and Harriet. The mood shifted. The scandal had become tangible. Harriet gave a brief statement, emphasizing that they trusted the legal system to bring the truth to light. Elara, trembling with relief and nerves, said nothing, letting Harriet's poised professionalism carry the moment. Once they were outside the media frenzy, Elara allowed herself a moment of triumph. They had forced Xavier's hand. An independent audit meant he couldn't bury his secrets forever. Yet a flicker of unease gnawed at her. Even cornered Xavier was a dangerous opponent. She feared what he might do next, personally or professionally, to reclaim the upper hand. But for now, victory tasted sweet, especially after weeks of relentless anxiety. Harriet treated Elara and Samson to a quiet lunch in a small bistro. Over salads and mineral water, they exchanged cautious smiles and talked about next steps. They'd have to stand firm through the audit, respond to each legal challenge, and keep forging ahead until a final settlement was reached, or until Xavier's entire web of deceit unraveled. "Enjoy this win," Harriet told Elara gently. "But don't let your guard down. The real battle has just begun." Elara nodded, placing a protective hand on her belly. She felt the baby move a reassuring flutter. In that moment, she vowed never to back down for herself and for her child. Nothing would break her resolve, not even a billionaire bent on vengeance. The audit took weeks of painstaking effort. An independent team of accountants and investigators appointed by the court dissected Xavier's sprawling empire with the precision of surgeons. They visited offices, sifted through digital ledgers, and interviewed staff who'd once lived in fear of Xavier's wrath. Slowly, a damning picture emerged. Illegal bribes to foreign officials, tax evasion, and money laundering all came to light. Anonymous whistleblowers, some likely motivated by Xavier's arrogant treatment of subordinates, came forward with additional evidence. Suddenly, the billionaire, who had once been hailed as a visionary philanthropist, found himself the subject of a federal investigation. News outlets latched on to the unfolding scandal. Martin Ross, the Boston Herald journalist, published a front-page exposé corroborating Harriet and Samson's findings. The story trended on social media for days, overshadowing previous rumors that had painted Elara as a gold digger. It was now Xavier who was in the hot seat, grappling with a swarm of cameras and demands for explanations. Caldwell Industries' stock plummeted. Board members panicked, calling emergency meetings to salvage their reputations. Philanthropic organizations distanced themselves, returning or suspending donations. Even long-time investors walked away, unwilling to be caught in the impending financial meltdown. Elara watched the chaos unfold on the news, her heart torn between relief and sorrow. She had never intended to bring down an entire corporation, only to protect herself and her child. Yet it was impossible to ignore the sense of justice. Xavier had spun a web of deceit and was finally being called to account. As the net closed in, Xavier's once untouchable aura shattered. Federal agents raided corporate headquarters, seizing computers and boxes of files. Rumors of indictments circulated. Reports suggested Xavier might face years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Hargraves tried to stem the tide with statements of innocence, but every day brought new incriminating evidence. Meanwhile, in family court, Xavier's position had never been weaker. Judge Connors held a follow-up hearing to assess progress on the financial audit. With the federal investigation looming, it was clear Xavier's empire was on the brink of collapse. Harriet requested a swift resolution to Elara's divorce, including substantial settlements to ensure the child's future. Hargraves, trying to negotiate, offered a settlement that included a lump sum and a trust fund for the baby. During an off-record negotiation session, Xavier himself showed up looking haggard and less composed than ever. Gone was the charismatic veneer. His eyes were bloodshot, and lines of stress etched his face. He glared at Elara, saying nothing at first. Then in a subdued voice he managed, "You've destroyed everything I built." "Are you happy?" Elara felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to lash out, to remind him that he was the one who had thrown her onto the streets, pregnant and terrified. Another part only felt pity for a man so consumed by power that he'd lost his humanity along the way. She mustered a calm response. "I only wanted what was fair for me and our child. You made the choices that led here, not me." Hargraves cut in, trying to salvage the moment. "Let's keep this civil, folks." He laid out the settlement terms. They included a sizable cash payment, a monthly stipend, and a promise to establish a trust in the child's name. It was more than what Elara had ever dreamed of receiving, but Harriet sensed an opportunity to push further. If Mr. Caldwell truly wishes to avoid further litigation and possible repercussions in criminal court, he should agree to a significantly larger settlement, Harriet said, her voice unyielding. Hargraves spluttered objections, but Xavier sighed, looking deflated. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. By the end of negotiations, Elara was set to receive a life-changing sum. The details would be ironed out formally in court, but for the first time since she'd been cast out of the mansion, she felt a profound sense of relief. She no longer had to fear homelessness or an uncertain future for her child. Yet she didn't feel triumphant. Watching Xavier slump in his chair, she realized how ambition and deceit had corroded his soul. His downfall was tragic, even if it was deserved. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the implosion. Implosion of an empire built on lies. Harriet reminded Elara to keep her composure as they left the negotiation room. Outside, paparazzi flashed cameras, hungry for a glimpse of the once powerful couple at war. Elara shielded her face, thinking of the child in her womb. This battle might be nearly over, but a new life awaited, a life she had to protect and nurture, free from the shadows of Xavier Caldwell's empire. That night, back at the shelter, she gently packed her belongings. She would soon have the resources to rent an apartment or even buy a small home. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of release. For all the heartbreak and fear, she had emerged on the other side, resolved to raise her child with love, honesty and dignity, values that money, for all its power, could never replace. In the weeks that followed, Elara moved into a modest but comfortable apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Sunlight streamed through the windows onto simple furniture, a second-hand couch, a thrift store dining table, a crib. She carefully assembled piece by piece. She felt a mix of pride and gratitude every time she glanced at the baby's growing space, complete with soft blankets and a few plush toys. Her legal divorce from Xavier was finalized in a low-key court proceeding. The settlement funds, monitored by a court-appointed trustee, were placed into Elara's account. A significant portion was also allocated into a secure trust for the child's education and future well-being. Xavier himself was conspicuously absent, reportedly preparing for a potential criminal trial. Elara signed the final paperwork with Harriet, By her side, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. With a few swipes of a pen, she was no longer Mrs. Caldwell, but Elara, the independent woman she once was, yet stronger than ever before. Media coverage of Xavier's impending criminal charges escalated. Each news segment highlighted the staggering list of alleged crimes. Caldwell Industries teetered on the edge of bankruptcy board members, resigning en masse. Government prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had taken advantage of the world's trust and generosity, only to line his own pockets through illicit schemes. Elara tried her best to ignore the maelstrom. She attended prenatal classes practicing breathing exercises and learning about childbirth. She made friends among the other expectant mothers, forging bonds that felt more genuine than the superficial social circles she once inhabited. Sometimes she caught glimpses of a tabloid on a newsstand, headlines like "Caldwell's Empire in Ruin" or "Billionaire's Betrayal." She walked past, uninterested in the lurid details. For her, the story was old news. She was focused on the road ahead. One afternoon, she met Harriet for tea. It had become a friendly tradition. No more stiff conference rooms or frantic phone calls, just two women who'd weathered a storm together. Harriet sipped her Earl Grey, smiling softly. "How do you feel now that it's all over?" Elara considered the question. "I feel lighter, free. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. But there's relief in knowing I can move forward without fear." "You deserve every bit of peace you can find," Harriet replied, her gaze warm. "No matter what happens to Xavier, you have a new life waiting for you." They chatted about the baby, about Harriet's own career aspirations, and Sampson's continued sleuthing on other high-stakes cases. Elara learned that Harriet had taken on more pro bono work since Elara's case, driven by a renewed sense of purpose in helping those who couldn't fight for themselves. Later that evening, while folding tiny onesies in the nursery corner of her apartment, Elara felt a sudden shift in her abdomen. A contraction, a real one. Then another. Panic flickered through her. The doctor had warned her she was close to her due date, but somehow it still caught her by surprise. She texted Harriet, who immediately offered to drive her to the hospital. The next hours blurred as she breathed through waves of pain, guided by a compassionate nurse and an obstetrician on duty. Harriet stood by her side, phone in hand, reassuring her. Elara held on to Harriet's arm and pressed through each contraction, sweat beading on her forehead. Finally, with a final powerful push, the cry of a newborn filled the room. "It's a girl," the doctor announced. They placed the tiny wailing infant on Elara's chest. Overwhelmed by emotion, Elara cradled her daughter with tears streaming down her face. In that moment, all the trials, betrayals, and heartbreak faded in the presence of pure, unconditional love. Harriet discreetly stepped out, giving them space. Elara studied her daughter's delicate features, the small nose, the scrunched eyes, the wisps of dark hair. She whispered a promise to raise her with honesty and kindness, to protect her from the lies and cruelty that once entangled their lives. In the days that followed, she brought her daughter home to their humble apartment. Each morning she awoke to soft coos and the warmth of new beginnings. Life wasn't perfect. She was a single mother starting from scratch. But she carried no illusions this time. She knew hard work and determination lay ahead. Yet in that simplicity, there was an honesty that made her heart soar. Looking back, she realized the end of Xavier Caldwell's empire was also the genesis of her own story, one marked not by money or prestige, but by resilience and hope. Each step she took now was grounded in a truth she'd earned through pain and perseverance. She would never again be the naive woman who believed in fairy tale promises. She was her own hero, writing a brand new chapter for herself and for the tiny life in her arms. Never let anyone tell you that your life's worth is measured by someone else's wealth, power, or status. Elara's journey through betrayal, homelessness, and heartbreak proves that true strength lives within us, even when we think all is lost. In the face of monstrous adversity, she found the courage to fight back, to stand up for her rights, and ultimately to break free from a web of deception that had once seemed inescapable. Her courtroom triumph wasn't just about a legal victory. It signaled the dawn of a new life, free from fear. Now a devoted mother, Elara, holds her baby close, embracing a future shaped by resilience and self-respect. If her story moved you, remember we all have the power to rise above life's most harrowing challenges. So please like, share, and subscribe to our channel together. Let's spread stories of hope and empowerment far and wide.